The fluorescent lights of a Pennsylvania nursing home hallway flicker against sterile white walls. It's 2:47 a.m., and the silence is broken only by the distant hum of medical equipment and the soft shuffle of night shift nurses checking on their charges. Behind door 237, a heart monitor's steady beeping suddenly transforms into a frantic alarm. Then, nothing. The flat line pierces the darkness with its relentless, damning tone. Nurses rush past the camera, their footsteps echoing against linoleum floors worn smooth by decades of similar emergencies. But something feels different tonight. The same thing that felt different last week and the week before. In the break room, whispered conversations stop abruptly when supervisors walk by. Families ask uncomfortable questions during visiting hours. Death certificates pile up with troubling frequency, each one signed with the same clinical detachment, the same unexplained cardiac events. The numbers don't lie, even when everyone tries to ignore them. Mortality rates spike during certain shifts. Patients who seemed stable at dinner are found cold by morning. The elderly die in nursing homes. This is expected, but not like this, not with such mechanical precision. Not with the quiet efficiency that leaves no witnesses, no explanations, only empty beds and grieving families who trusted their loved ones to professional care. By spring 2023, the rumors could no longer be contained within administrative offices and staff meetings. Patients were dying, not from age or illness, but from something far more sinister. Someone wearing scrubs, someone trusted with society's most vulnerable lives, had been moving through these halls like a shadow. In places meant for care and dignity, someone had turned mercy into murder. In the small town of Butler, Pennsylvania, Heather Irene Pressdee once dreamed of saving lives. Born into a working-class family in 1982, she was the kind of child who nursed injured birds back to health and talked endlessly about becoming a doctor. Her mother worked double shifts at a local diner. Her father repaired cars in their backyard garage. They scraped together every penny to give their daughter opportunities they never had. Her teachers remembered her as bright, determined, perhaps too determined. Even in elementary school, Heather needed to be the one bandaging scraped knees on the playground, the one organizing the other children during recess. She possessed an intensity that made adults uncomfortable, a need to control situations that went beyond normal childhood leadership. When she announced at age 12 that she would become a nurse, no one questioned it. It seemed like destiny. Her family pushed relentlessly for academic success, viewing education as their daughter's ticket to a better life. But nursing school at Butler County Community College revealed cracks in the carefully constructed facade. Classmates recalled her frustration when patients didn't follow instructions, her visible impatience with those she deemed difficult or non-compliant. During clinical rotations at local hospitals, supervisors noted her tendency to work alone, her reluctance to ask for help, her sharp criticism of patients who complained about pain. She graduated with solid grades and glowing letters of recommendation, but something fundamental had shifted. The girl who once cried over wounded animals now spoke about patients with clinical detachment. Her early performance reviews praised her technical skills while quietly noting interpersonal challenges and difficulty with empathy. What no one realized was that this resentment was crystallizing into something much darker, a belief that she alone understood what these patients truly needed. Her early career became a series of fresh starts and burned bridges. Hospital administrators would hire her based on impressive credentials, only to watch as conflicts erupted within months. She bounced from facility to facility, always seeking new positions, always finding fault with her previous workplace. Coworkers described a pattern: initial competence followed by growing conflicts, complaints about lazy colleagues, and increasingly sharp criticisms of patient care standards. By 2022, 20 years into her nursing career, Heather Pressdee had become someone entirely different from the idealistic young woman who entered the profession. The healthcare system had worn her down, or so she told herself. Budget cuts meant heavier patient loads. Understaffing meant working double shifts. Administrative bureaucracy meant endless paperwork that kept her from real patient care. She watched colleagues quit in exhaustion while she endured, convincing herself that her persistence made her superior. Working the night shift at Quality Life Services, she found herself alone with the most vulnerable: elderly patients with dementia who cried out in confusion, those too weak to call for help, residents whose families rarely visited and wouldn't notice subtle changes. In her increasingly distorted thinking, she began to see herself as their savior. Why should they linger in facilities that were understaffed and underfunded? Why should families suffer watching their loved ones deteriorate? Why should she watch helplessly as patients endured what she considered meaningless suffering? Insulin became her weapon of choice after months of careful consideration. As a registered nurse, she had legitimate access to medication rooms. As a trusted professional, she could enter patient rooms at any hour without question. And as a substance, insulin was nearly undetectable in routine autopsies. Blood sugar crashes were tragically common in elderly patients with diabetes. She began studying dosages, researching how much it would take, how quickly it would work. The first time she withdrew the clear liquid into a syringe with murderous intent, her hands were completely steady. She had found her calling, twisted though it was. The first confirmed murder happened on a cold November night in 2022. An 87-year-old woman named Dorothy, frail but mentally sharp, had been particularly difficult during her evening medication routine. She'd questioned why her insulin dose seemed different, had refused to take pills that didn't look right, had been what Heather considered insufferably uncooperative. The patient had even pressed her call button repeatedly, demanding to speak with the charge nurse about medication errors. That night, as Dorothy slept fitfully in her narrow hospital bed, Heather entered the room carrying a syringe filled with insulin, far more insulin than any diabetic patient should ever receive. The injection was swift, professional, administered with the same clinical precision she'd perfected over 2 decades of nursing. She disposed of the syringe in the sharps container, charted routine vital signs in Dorothy's medical record, and returned to the nurse's station to continue her shift. Dorothy's blood sugar plummeted rapidly, sending her body into hypoglycemic shock. Her breathing became shallow, her pulse irregular. By 4 a.m., she was unconscious. By 6 a.m., she was dead. The morning shift found her body and called the attending physician, who noted her diabetes history and signed a death certificate listing natural causes, cardiac arrest secondary to diabetic complications. The family, devastated but not surprised given Dorothy's age and medical conditions, arranged for burial within the week. No one questioned the death. No one ordered additional testing. In nursing homes, death was simply part of the cycle, expected, inevitable, bureaucratically routine. But something profound had awakened in Heather that night. The absolute power she felt as life slipped away, the complete control she finally had over outcomes that had frustrated her for years. It was more intoxicating than she had imagined. The killing had been so simple, so clean, so final. Dorothy was no longer complaining, no longer suffering, and Heather had been the decisive instrument of that peace. 3 weeks later, she killed again. By early 2023, random acts of what Heather saw as mercy weren't enough to satisfy her growing compulsion. She developed specific criteria for selecting victims: patients who complained too much about their care, those who were rude to staff members, residents she believed had no meaningful quality of life remaining. Her twisted logic convinced her she was performing a vital service, cleaning up the emotional and financial mess that others were too weak or too selfish to address. Her methodology became increasingly sophisticated and calculated. She learned the perfect timing for each facility, when shifts changed and documentation was rushed, when other staff were busy with emergencies in different wings, when family members weren't visiting and wouldn't notice subtle changes in their loved ones. She studied surveillance camera placement, memorized blind spots in hallways, perfected her technique for administering lethal injections without leaving obvious needle marks. The pace of killing accelerated dramatically. Some weeks, she would murder 3 or 4 patients, moving between different facilities across western Pennsylvania like a methodical angel of death. She kept mental notes about which patients had family members who asked too many questions, which ones had advocates who might demand autopsies, which deaths would blend seamlessly into the expected mortality statistics of elderly care facilities. Her confidence grew with each successful killing. She began taking risks that would have terrified her months earlier, injecting patients in rooms adjacent to nurses' stations, killing on nights when supervisors were making rounds, even murdering patients whose families had been visiting just hours before. The deaths spread across multiple nursing homes as she strategically changed jobs, making the pattern nearly impossible for any single administrator to detect. Heather had successfully weaponized the very trust and systemic fragmentation that the healthcare system was built upon. Confidence, however, breeds the kind of carelessness that brings down even the most careful predators. In March 2023, Heather selected her next victim, Robert, a 73-year-old diabetic patient who had irritated her by repeatedly questioning his medication schedule and demanding to speak with doctors about his treatment plan. She waited until 3 a.m., entered his room with practiced stealth, and injected what should have been a lethal dose of insulin directly into his IV line. But Robert's body proved more resilient than her previous victims. Instead of slipping quietly into unconsciousness and death, he began thrashing violently in his bed, calling out in confusion and distress. His blood sugar crashed dangerously low, but his cardiovascular system fought back with unexpected strength. The commotion woke his roommate, who immediately pressed a call button for nursing assistance. When the night shift charge nurse arrived, she found Robert in severe hypoglycemic distress, sweating profusely, disoriented, his heart racing irregularly. His symptoms were severe enough to warrant an immediate transfer to the hospital emergency room. A sharp-eyed nurse practitioner in the ER, suspicious of the dramatic presentation, ordered comprehensive blood work including detailed insulin levels. The results were staggering. Robert's blood contained insulin levels that were astronomical, nearly 10 times higher than his prescribed medication regimen could possibly account for. For the first time in months of systematic killing, someone said the word that would unravel Heather's entire operation: suspicious. Hospital administrators began pulling Robert's medical records, comparing his treatment timeline to staffing schedules. Heather's name appeared prominently in the documentation from his final night at the nursing facility. The investigation that would expose America's latest monster had finally begun. When the first news report surfaced in late March 2023 about unexplained deaths at Pennsylvania nursing homes, the story exploded across social media with the force of a digital wildfire. Headlines screamed about an angel of death nurse stalking elderly patients, and amateur internet detectives began obsessively connecting dots between facility locations, death dates, and employment records. True crime podcasters dissected every leaked detail. Facebook groups formed overnight, dedicated to tracking the investigation and sharing theories about the scope of the crimes. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office desperately tried to control the narrative, releasing carefully worded statements about an ongoing investigation into suspicious deaths, while refusing to confirm specific details. But panic had already spread like a contagion through the eldercare community. Families rushed to move their loved ones out of any facility where Heather might have worked, creating chaos in an already strained system. Some nursing homes saw exodus-level departures, leaving vulnerable patients without care options. Financial markets reacted with predictable brutality. Stocks of major nursing home chains plummeted as investors fled anything connected to elder care. Insurance companies began reviewing policies and demanding additional safety protocols. Trust in the entire long-term care system, already fragile after years of COVID-19 scandals and regulatory failures, shattered completely under the weight of this new horror. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, law enforcement agencies coordinated the largest nursing home investigation in Pennsylvania history. They methodically exhumed bodies from multiple counties, re-examined hundreds of death certificates, interviewed thousands of staff members and grieving family members. Digital forensic specialists analyzed security footage from dozens of facilities. The scope of Heather's potential crimes became clearer with each passing day. At least 17 suspicious deaths spanning multiple facilities, and nearly a year of systematic killing, all connected to one trusted healthcare professional who had exploited society's most sacred trust. On May 11, 2023, police arrived at Heather Pressdee's modest apartment in Butler County. She answered the door in scrubs, having just returned from a night shift. The arresting officers later described her demeanor as unnaturally calm. No surprise, no tears, no protests of innocence. She simply asked if she could change clothes before they took her away. During her interrogation, Heather spoke about her victims with clinical detachment. She admitted to some of the killings, but framed them as acts of compassion. They were suffering, she told detectives, her voice flat and emotionless. I was helping them find peace. When pressed about the patients who weren't terminally ill, she claimed they had no quality of life. Psychologists who evaluated her noted her complete lack of empathy, her narcissistic belief that she alone understood what was best for her patients. She had rewritten the narrative of murder into mercy, of crime into compassion. Even as the evidence mounted against her, she maintained that twisted self-image. She wasn't a killer, she was a healer who had the courage to do what others wouldn't. On May 2, 2024, Heather Pressdee stood before a packed courtroom as Judge Gregory Kritzer read her sentence. The charges were staggering: 3 counts of first-degree murder, 19 counts of attempted murder, and multiple counts of aggravated assault. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Insulin found in victims who weren't diabetic, her presence at every suspicious death, her own admissions to investigators. The families of her victims filled the courtroom, some weeping openly as they heard details of their loved ones' final moments. Others stared at Heather with a mixture of rage and incomprehension. How could someone who had taken an oath to heal have become such an instrument of death? Judge Kritzer sentenced her to 3 consecutive life terms plus 380 to 760 years in prison, ensuring she would never again have the opportunity to harm another vulnerable person. As the bailiff led her away, Heather showed no emotion. Even in defeat, she seemed to believe she had been misunderstood rather than exposed. In the end, Heather Irene Pressdee represents the darkest perversion of everything we trust about healthcare. She took the sacred oath to first do no harm and twisted it into a weapon. She used her position of trust to prey upon those who couldn't defend themselves. She turned places of healing into hunting grounds. The victims' families still struggle with questions that have no satisfying answers. How many others died by her hand? How long had she been killing before anyone noticed? Could their loved ones have been saved if someone had spoken up sooner? Perhaps the most chilling aspect of her case is how easily she moved through the healthcare system, how her crimes went undetected for months. She exploited the very compassion that makes healthcare possible, the trust that patients and families must place in those who care for the most vulnerable. She wore the uniform of an angel, but her hands wrote the signatures of death.